Hello, and thank you for joining me for Weston 101, a pre-production look at our 2018 season at the Weston Playhouse. I'm Piper Goodeve, Director of Education and Artistic Associate. Today we'll be talking about the iconic Broadway musical West Side Story. West Side Story has a book by Arthur Laurents, music by Leonard Bernstein, lyrics by Stephen Sondheim, and was conceived and choreographed by Jerome Robbins. It takes its inspiration from William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. The original Broadway production in 1957 was nominated for 6 Tony Awards, and Jerome Robbins won for Best Choreography. Set in New York City in the 1950s, West Side Story follows the classic tragic framework, with all of the action happening over the course of just a couple days. We meet 2 gangs of young men from different backgrounds, the Jets and the Sharks, trying to coexist on the streets of Manhattan's Upper West Side. And we meet a pair of star-crossed lovers, Maria and Tony. West Side Story asks the question, as Arthur Laurents put it, how can love survive in a violent world of prejudice? Though written in the late 1950s, the themes and message of West Side Story are still relevant today, and in fact, feel very contemporary. Set against the backdrop of a diverse and hectic city and scored with gorgeous ballads and lively dance numbers, West Side Story is a love story that, on some level, resonates with everyone. I had the pleasure of sitting down with director Tim Fort and choreographer Felicity Stiverson to talk about this groundbreaking musical and our 2018 Weston production.
Thank you guys so much for joining me today in New York City to talk about West Side Story. I'm really excited about this piece, as I know you guys are too, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be able to talk about this with you guys, because I think it's going to be really fun. So I would love to start off by asking Tim why this show was picked for Weston in the 2018 season.
Steve Stetler and I both started working at the Playhouse in 1973. Don't do the math. but
Very bad math, so it's okay.
In that first season, we, besides surviving a flood, we had 5 shows. And among the 5 shows were a show called Our Town, which featured Sam Lloyd and was our first chance to act on stage with him. And the final show of the season was a little show called West Side Story. And so we thought, hey, that would be a show, and probably we thought this in 1973, that would be a show that did really well. We'll probably do it a lot more times because everyone loves West Side Story. And as it turns out, as we continued to get a little more sophisticated with Weston and work through things, it turned out that West Side Story is a show that's not very easy to do. We kind of realized, and even in 1973, it was done initially at Weston and then moved on to Amherst College, where it was played at the beginning of their school year. And well, I'm sure we'll talk about the many reasons why it's crazy to do West Side Story, but
We'll get to that.
but when you get an opportunity to do it, and with all the things that we have loved about it all along, I don't think it's unfair to say that we're all Sondheim freaks. And with all the other incredible talent that worked on that original West Side Story, we've all been fans of it for a long time and thought, well, we just kept putting it off. Well, we'll do it next year. We really want to do it, and we kept putting it off. And now there are no more years to put it off. It's a perfect year to do it. It's the 100th anniversary of Leonard Bernstein's birth, and many other reasons that it's perfect to do it. And we just said, we're going to do it this year as a way to celebrate all our decades at Weston and to celebrate this show and to celebrate how we feel about American theater. It couldn't have been a better time.
Yeah. I also think that there's something, the perfect time to do it also because, Felicity, you've been a part of the Weston family for so long now and have done West Side Story so many times, so that fit. The timing was perfect. Essentially, you were waiting for Felicity.
Essentially,
There's no question about that.
All these years.
Felicity, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your history with this piece and how many times you've done it and what productions you've worked on and what excites you about doing it at Weston.
So excited to do it here at Weston. West Side Story and I have a long history. It was really the first big show I did out of college. I booked the European tour of West Side Story, and the man who was the director and choreographer of that was Alan Johnson. He was in the original 1957 production. And so he cast me in that show, and I learned all the choreography from him. So really, like, I learned the original Robbins from somebody who was in the original production, which is amazing. And I ended up doing the show with Alan 2 more times, once in Houston and once the 50th anniversary tour in the US. So I've done it with him a bunch of times. I've staged it before. So yeah, this is definitely, it's been a thread through my whole career, and I couldn't be more excited to kind of bring it full circle and be doing it with Tim at one of my favorite theaters in the world. So yeah, super excited. Like, because I learned it from Alan Johnson, I really want to honor him. I want to honor the tradition of dancers passing this iconic choreography down to each other. I feel really lucky to have learned it from him. And I want to honor the piece by, I just think his choreography for this piece is perfect. It's so musical. It is like another instrument in this incredible score. Because a lot of, there's a Bible that exists that I have, that it's like notes about, all the choreography is written down in like shorthand. And that's amazing, and it's been kind of passed down through all these generations of dancers, and it's so special to have that. But the actual passing down of like all the intentions behind the movement, little stories about how Alan would teach something to us when we were first learning it, that stuff isn't in that book. And so the fact that I have that, I'm just really excited to pass those things on to this new generation of dancers. And it's so exciting, even though it's the original choreography. Every time I stage like certain numbers or the show on a new group of dancers and actors, it's so exciting to see what energy and new life they bring to it. So even though it's this iconic choreography, these traditions that have been passed down from generation to generation of dancers and actors, every cast and every group of actors brings something so special and exciting to it.
West Side Story was produced in 1957 originally, and although it was fairly popular, did not win the Tony Award as Best Musical. What won, Felicity?
A little show called Music Man.
Yeah, a little show called Music Man, which we did last year. That's really the fame of West Side Story can be attributed to the film, which did win the Academy Award, and popularized the piece at the right time, I think, and moved it beyond its Broadway roots. But among the people who worked on West Side Story, besides Jerome Robbins, who was director choreographer, was a pretty extraordinary lyric and composing team. One was very famous already. That was Leonard Bernstein, who had already written Candide, Wonderful Town, On the Town. I wish he hadn't written both On the Town and Wonderful Town, because I get totally confused.
Yeah, a lot of time.
But he was already well known, not just for his Broadway work, but for his conducting work with the New York Philharmonic, and very popular. He'd already been on television talking to these young people, concerts and so forth. And then there was this young lyricist who was very frustrated because he wanted to be both a composer-lyricist, and he'd written his first show in 1954. Piper, what was the name of that show? You probably can guess.
Oh gosh, you're putting me on the spot.
Yeah, because you were in it.
Saturday Night.
Yes, that's right. A playwright named Arthur Lawrence, who also had some history, but mostly as a playwright, not as a musical theater playwright. When he started talking to Leonard Bernstein about and Jerome Robbins about creating this musical that might be, at first it was called East Side Story, it was going to be Jewish and I forget
Catholic.
who, Catholic,
Yeah.
right. But he thought maybe Leonard Bernstein would need some help lyrically, and Leonard Bernstein agreed. So he thought, now who do I know who can write good dialogue for young men? And because that's what the show is going to be about. And he thought of this Stephen Sondheim guy, who is now 27 years old.
Yeah.
West Side Story started to be in trouble, even though it had Jerome Robbins, arguably the greatest choreographer of the 20th century, and certainly somebody who's going to go on and do things like Gypsy and Fiddler on the Roof, and he had Leonard Bernstein, already very famous. He had his friend Stephen Sondheim in it. He had Arthur Lawrence, who was a good playwright, but it wasn't landing somehow. And they kept losing producers. So they called up Hal Prince, who was up in Boston. He said, I don't know, George Abbott says, no, I shouldn't bother producing this play. And Hal came down, he saw it, and they wound up finding the money and putting West Side Story on. So in one room, you have Harold Prince, who's won more Tonys than anyone else in the history. I think he won 8 as producer, 7 as director, nominated for 16 more Tony Awards. You have Stephen Sondheim, no shabby lyricist there, who is about to reinvent musical theater with Harold Prince. You have Jerome Robbins. You have Arthur Lawrence, who is going to go on and, after this particular show, write a show called Gypsy. And then you have, actually the premier set designer of the day, Oliver Smith. You had Jeannie Rosenthal, the great lighting designer. This was a show that shouldn't have missed, and ultimately it almost did. But when you look at each contribution by all those amazing people, you realize that each of them has something to say about what the next generation would learn about how to do musical theater. So that's the 1957 history of this piece. And you can see why, if you're teaching musical theater, you want to start there, because basically doesn't everything build off of that? Sondheim and Prince are going to go on to reinvent musical theater with companies, Sweeney Todd, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Follies, Little Night Music. You know what I always point out about how prescient Sondheim was in writing the lyrics for West Side Story. There's a lyric in that song, America, in which he says, or the character says, nobody knows in America, Puerto Rico's in America. And of course that just goes by in the 1950s and 60s. But it's very, very meaningful now. It's
very current.
Like he's thinking ahead.
I know. I was thinking about it, and I was like, okay, so this is a classic because, unfortunately, we are always still dealing with these issues, right? And how wonderful it would be if there was a day when we could really be like, so what is the relevance of West Side Story?
Right.
Because it would be great if we weren't constantly dealing with these issues, and we could say, okay, we have to try and make West Side Story or Romeo and Juliet relevant for 2018. Because
so people could relate to it.
Right, because those issues are non-issues now. But unfortunately, we're still dealing with that. But fortunately, we have this gorgeous piece in which to work through that.
And it's so important that we look at the polarization today, not just in gang wars, but in politics and in gender and all those things that need to be addressed and find a place for us, basically. And the possibility of that happening is so clear in West Side Story that I think that's probably why it's endured so well. There are a lot of shows, as we know, that have great scores but don't quite endure because the book itself was based in a time when the ideas about society were different, and we don't want to go back there. But this is so universal and so hopeful and so beautiful on so many levels.